What's going on, team? You've got Terrence Latimer here, information communications technologist and consultant based in the Mojave Desert, here to chat regarding all things information architecture. We've had a super exciting week this week discussing information architecture and what it means as it relates to information systems, the way that we as information and knowledge workers log into our various devices, our various technologies in order to pull out information and then to obviously put information back into the system, right? And so information architecture is exactly what it sounds like in the form of how are we designing the systems, the tools, the online or the digital experiences in the way that we access and or manipulate this information so that we can do things with it, right? And so we started out this past Monday defining broadly what information architecture is. On Tuesday, we talked a bit about the relationship between information architecture and logical reasoning and understanding. On Wednesday, we talked about ways to group and structure information, some of the different ways that we categorize information. Yesterday, we talked about information architecture and taxonomy, so the way that we are labeling the information that we are accessing in our systems. And today, we're going to dive a little bit more into information architecture and that broad overlap with systems, particularly as it relates to enterprise resource planning. So super excited to be chatting with you all today. Hope this lesson doesn't take too long because I do want you to get back to your Friday and enjoying the weekend, but definitely wanted to drop some content or drop this video so that we could finish the week out strong and look towards next week. So as it relates to information architecture, the biggest thing that I want you to remember is that as information and knowledge workers, it's really important for us to be able to log into our various systems, right? Whether it's your customer relationship management tool, whether it's your text processor where you're writing your emails or your reports, or whether it's a design tool to be able to quickly log in and pull the information that you need so that you can distribute it, right, to the different places that it needs to go. Whether it's in an email or on a phone call or in a text message or something along those lines, right? And then on the exact opposite side, it then becomes really important to have systems in place to pull information into the system, right? So typically communications is not a one-way street. You send an email to someone and then someone responds back to you, right? Or you have a phone call with someone and you're not just talking to them forever. They're speaking to you about something and maybe you're taking notes and you then figure out a way to digitize those notes so that you can share that information with someone in your team. And so, the way that I really want you to, just sort of think about the way that you are architecting or structuring your information is that you want to be empathetic not only to yourself, but then also to your teammates and the other people who are responsible for accessing or being able to tap into that said information, right? And so, there are just a couple of best practices, things that we can do in order to make this process easier, which, we definitely talked about earlier this week, right? Creating a logical organization and taxonomy, and then also, just some discipline and standards around the way that we are storing information, not just in our brains, but in our digital products and tools like our computers or our cell phones so that we can quickly access said information, right? And we're doing it in a way where we are not wasting time. Remember, as information and knowledge workers, our time and our energy is some of the most valuable things or some of the most valuable resources that we have in order to get our job done, right? And so if we're spending all of our time trying to remember stuff or, looking in all of these different places for information, well, typically we're wasting time and we're wasting energy. And, if we're doing some quick math, right? Well, if we're wasting our time, we're wasting our energy. Well, typically we're wasting money. Right? And one of the challenges is that if we don't have the systems in place in order to measure our inefficiency, well, then we're not quite sure what that is costing us. But there is a very real cost associated with inefficiency. And so, broadly, I really want you to focus this week on, or, just something I want you to consider is what is the cost of inefficiency to you, to your organization, to your business, to your customers as a result of not being able to quickly identify the information that you need, that you can then translate information into wisdom and knowledge, right? But then also just being super mindful of what are some things that we can do in order to minimize or to eliminate some of those inefficiencies. And that then is where I'm introducing this concept, or just speaking again regarding this concept around enterprise resource planning. And it's super important. If you walk away with anything today, I just want you to remember that as it relates to your enterprise or your organization, one of the primary resources that you need to focus on maximizing the use of and really protecting is your information. And your information broadly is your value proposition. It is, your secret sauce. It might be like private data, right? It might be your intellectual property. It might be your content calendar and your social media campaigns, right? But I really just want you to focus on figuring out some ways based off of some of our conversation today around information architecture to really start considering your information to be a resource that you then want to plan your organizational activities around. And we'll spend a little bit of time talking about unified communications, how external communications work in collaboration with internal communications, but just really setting the stage here today, right? Today is all about information architecture and the alignment with our digital tools and products. And let's look at it through this lens of enterprise resource planning. How can our organizations plan around the resources that are most important to us in the form of our information, our data, our knowledge, and ultimately our institutional wisdom? So as it relates to this concept of information management and knowledge, right? One thing that I really want you to be mindful of and to be considerate of is you and then the stakeholders or the individuals that are responsible for engaging with you. And what I mean by that, as it relates to information architecture and as it relates to enterprise resource planning, is that, information is coming at us 24/7, all hours of the day. Right? We're getting phone calls, we're getting emails, we're getting all text messages, notifications, right? We're getting really important information that requires us to do something with it, right? Typically in the form of processing or thinking about it, right? So that we can then translate that information into something that is actionable, right? In the form of some form of artifact or documentation, an email, a report, a memo, a campaign that we are then using to communicate what we know to other people, which is where we're considering the importance of internal communications versus external communication. So, regardless of what your job is, one of the first things that I want you to be mindful of as it relates to information architecture is really understanding all the different systems and tools that are coming, that are part of your toolbox. Right? And so what I mean by that is, start just figuring out or start documenting, be empathetic to yourself, understand all the different sources or the different places that data or that information is coming to you, right? And then once you spend a little bit of time considering all the places that information, is coming to you, start thinking about, what are some things or what are some ways that you responsibly are organizing this information so that it's not overwhelming for you, right? And some, best practices or things to consider are, with your email, for a perfect example. What I want you to be mindful of as it relates to information architecture is, what are some of your rules as it relates to the way that you use email so that you can stay organized and not be overwhelmed? Well, you might use a labeling or a categorizing system, right? Where you say, okay, well, these are external emails versus internal emails, or, Google does a really great job of this if you're a Google user in that. And so broadly, this process of developing an understanding regarding user needs doesn't have to be super complicated. My best recommendation is to take advantage of the various market research tools and best practices out there in the form of interviews or surveys, perhaps focus groups, right? But the idea is that you begin the process of developing a shared language rooted in logic that allows people to quickly recall or to remember the information or the data that they are responsible for, so that as the communications are more consistent, right, it doesn't become this process of having to take a million years or an inordinate amount of time in order to access said information. And that then is, you'll hear me talk very often about tools and rules. What are your tools and what are the different rules for using those rules? And typically it's being able to have a micro perspective and a micro perspective on what those tools are, and micro rules for some of those tools. But then where the enterprise comes in is in understanding how your tools are working together and what are your rules for how those tools should be used together, right? And that then is where the empathy comes in the form of, it shouldn't be a big deal to reach out to a customer and say, hey, I really want to make sure that you get this contract. So what is your favorite format for receiving and signing contracts? Would you prefer that I send it to you via DocuSign, or would you prefer that I use a pen and paper and put it in an envelope and send it to you directly in the mail? Right? And that then becomes part of your responsibility, is in understanding and making some decisions on what your customers' wants and desires are, and then what your wants and desires are based off of your understanding of your enterprise, your organization, and the way that information flows in and out of the system that you are responsible for architecting based off of where it is that you want to go. And so empathy, in the form of understanding what you are responsible for, being empathetic to yourself, as well as being empathetic to your end user, whether it's an internal teammate or an external vendor or customer, really comes in the form of mutual and shared understanding. And so you've heard me mention this already in this video, but based off of your industry, your job title, the job titles of your individual stakeholders, and how you are responsible for manipulating and sharing information amongst one another, it then does become really important to start defining things, right? And so what I mean by that is having a shared vernacular or a shared dictionary or thesaurus or something along the lines where that you are using words and language in the exact same way is going to be paramount. It's going to be paramount to the way that you design your information architecture, and particularly in the ways and the formats that you are then pulling information out of the system and putting information into the system, right? And so some things that I want you to be mindful of or to be considerate of are, again, like naming conventions. What are things called? And are you using the words the same way that other people are? Because if not, you then want to figure out perhaps what the overlap is, or how they're using specific language, how you're using specific language, and what is meant by said language. And so making decisions on what things are called. Is it called a customer? Is it called a vendor? Is it called a partner? Is a report a memo, right? The more work that we can do on the front end in order to define those things is going to create efficiencies later down the road, because we know that we're using the vernacular, we're using word choices in the exact same way. Right? But if we're spending all of this time trying to, well, what did you mean by that? Or I don't know what you meant by that. Or we're creating confusion. And that's the last thing that we want. We want clear, concise, shared information, shared data, that everyone is on the same page about, everybody understands it, so that we can then begin the process of working together and making decisions with each other based off of this mutual understanding. And so that then becomes the next part of today's conversation. I really want you to be mindful of the importance of creating a logical or perhaps a hierarchical organizational structure. And I know that might sound a little bit intense, but really what I want you to understand is that information is and communications are dynamic. Now, if you look at your favorite organizational chart, which communicates how a company should be operated, well, typically you might have a board of directors at the top, and then followed by the executive team, which might be led by a CEO. Then directly below them might be a set of VPs, below them might be directors, below them might be your frontline employees, right? And that then very broadly communicates the way that information is architected and flows throughout the organization. And not to say that the board of directors doesn't have any sort of influence or conversations with frontline employees, right? But typically those have to go through various levels of filters in order for that information to travel. And so, the things that become really important that then help us to contextualize a way that a board of directors is supposed to work with a team of VPs. There are a million different ways that we can focus on that. Now, a lot of teams focus on developing internal departments. Internal departments are responsible for their own individual initiatives, and then collaboratively, based off of the way that information flows from top down, bottom up. It also flows dynamically, right, from left to right, et cetera, et cetera. That then helps to create a system for locating and identifying the information at any given time for teammates to accomplish goals. And so that's just one example, right? I just provided an example in the form of an HR department, right? In the way that, again, how an organization might be structured. Information architecture can be applied to a marketing department, to a sales department, and then also something to be mindful of is that information architecture, again, is not just about the way that things are running internally, but then also about our hierarchy and the way that we elevate communications externally. At what point does our unified communications or our shared internal message, how does that then get communicated externally to our customers? What are our tools and rules for doing so? What is how do we manipulate and share information with the press? How do we share information with vendors? What are our rules for sharing information with our customers? And what then is the logical hierarchy in order to do so? Right? At what point is it better to pick up the phone and have a conversation versus sending an email with a report and documentation attached to that? Who internally is responsible for that? And in the same way, what then is our process for pulling information into our system, whether you're a director or a VP, and then what then is that process for communicating that to your internal pod or internal division, or perhaps company-wide, right? These are things that we need to consider as it relates to our hierarchy or the way that we are structuring the flow of information in and out of our system. So as it relates to your hierarchy, the way that we, again, are classifying the way that information should flow in and out of our system, the way that information needs to flow into our enterprise, right? Because again, our information is a resource that we need to plan for. I would really encourage you to study this concept around faceted classification, which I'm gonna quickly give you the Wikipedia definition of. But faceted classification is going to be a way for you to begin this process of structuring and organizing your information so that you can then make some decisions on how that information should flow in and out of your system. Wikipedia states that faceted classification, a faceted classification is a classification schema used in organizing knowledge into a systematic order. A faceted classification uses semantic categories, naming conventions, either general or subject specific, that are then combined to create the full classification entry. Many library classification systems use a combination of a fixed, enumerative taxonomy of concepts with subordinate facets that further refine the topic. Now that sounds really confusing, and I get it, and I don't want to confuse you. So, one of my favorite things for you to consider in the form of who uses a fantastic faceted classification system. Well, I'm a book nerd, so I love libraries. Libraries are probably one of the most beautifully structured information or knowledge management systems or databases in the world. But let's use everyone's favorite streaming platform, Netflix. Netflix is freaking amazing, or Netflix is amazing as it relates to the way that they structure information. Now, if you were to just log into Netflix and try to find a movie, it would be overwhelming. You wouldn't know where to start. They've got thousands and thousands and thousands of titles available to you. And so, in addition to having some very complex algorithms behind closed doors that help you to, in order to help you uncover or discover the information that you want in the moment, Netflix has done a pretty decent job, or a pretty solid job, or structuring the information or architecting the information, classifying the information in their platform based off of a couple of shared language, right? They have structured their movies into action movies or to dramas or to comedies. Now, if you were to go into the comedy section, you might see 4 or 5 different types of comedy, which would then, that then does some additional work in the form of helping you to find just the right kind of comedy movie that you want in the moment. But these very broad buckets offer enough of a shared understanding where Netflix is one of the most popular streaming platforms on the planet, because not only do they have this vast catalog of movies, right, but then they have done a great job of helping you define the exact movie or the exact title that is going to resonate with you, that you're going to want to continue to pay for month over month, right? So again, tools and rules are super important concepts as it relates to classifying the data or the information that we are responsible for, so that our enterprises, right, can create a bit of shareability. And with shareability comes deep collaboration. Something that I want you to be mindful of, and I don't want to spend too much time with, is just an understanding that our information systems they're dynamic. They change with time. And so if you have considered that your labeling and your classification system, at any given moment, it has the ability to expand or contract depending on your enterprise or your organization and your goals. So some things that I just want you to be considerate of is scalability, right? And what I mean by that is, just being mindful of the vast amount of information that your enterprise is responsible for, at the moment. Well, if we are then making some predictions on what the requirements of that system are going to look like in the future, being mindful of the ability to attach alternative or additional categories based off of the ability of your organization to grow, right? So again, scalability is a concept that we don't want to spend too much time in today, but I just want you to be mindful of that, is that your categories, in the same way that, using the previous example, Netflix has created some very broad categories for movies. However, they give themselves a little bit of flexibility in understanding that there might be new categories of movies that come in. Perhaps there are short films or animations, et cetera, right? So understanding the way that your organization is either going to grow or going to shrink, scalability, is an important concept that should provide you with a bit of flexibility, or might constrain you depending on the way that you look at it. But just something that you should be mindful of is scalability as it relates to information architecture. Now, as it relates to your information architecture, you've heard me say several times during this video the importance of defining your tools and rules. And, again, having or developing a shared vernacular or shared dictionary, thesaurus, however it is that you want, shared language, regarding specific tools, it does become important to understand your organization more broadly. And just using this Netflix example, a lot of us, or several of us, don't just have Netflix, right? Yet we are still interested in watching movies, right? And so as a result of that, you might have subscriptions to Hulu, to Disney Plus, to Amazon Prime. And so, unfortunately, these tools tend to not work together. You tend to have individual subscriptions with, the individual platform. But we have a little bit more flexibility as it relates to our enterprises, particularly as it relates to most of the tools or the digital tools and systems that we use in order to manipulate and share and distribute our knowledge, right? And so just some things that I want you to be mindful of are, being able to have specific language and rules as it relates to the individual tools that you are using, but then also the importance of having a broader sort of language and understanding as it relates to the way that your tools are working and engaging with one another in order for you to manipulate and to share information. And when I use the phrase manipulate, I really don't want you to, leverage that or to see that as something that is negative. What I really mean is that you're processing information and turning that into something else. And so if we are then mindful of the typical information worker, what your average day is like, perhaps you get an email and your email is from your boss saying, hey, we need this report by this time, can you get it done? And so you might do several things. You might send a quick reply that says confirmed, or you might send a text message. You might then log into your calendar tool and set a deadline for yourself. You might pull up your favorite text processing tool in the form of a spreadsheet, or Excel, or a spreadsheet tool, or Google Docs or Microsoft Word. And then you begin the process of, perhaps logging into different research databases, or you might need to pick up the phone and call a customer, right? And so all of these different tools are being incorporated into the way that we are translating that information and organizing it and architecting it into something else. And so it then becomes really important, again, in order to develop shared understanding, is being able to have specific language as it relates to these individual tools, but then also broader organization or enterprise level language that then helps to communicate things in the form of, what sort of value is being delivered, right? And who that value is being delivered to. An internal memo and the rules for sharing and disseminating information in an internal memo is going to look a little bit different, not completely different, but a little bit different than the way that you would, perhaps share a contract or a proposal to a client or an external vendor. And so understanding that, and that's where then enterprise resource planning comes in, is in the form of understanding how all of these tools, how they work together, right? How we as individuals leverage and work with these tools, but then how they all work together so that we can then translate or transmit value. And all value is, in this instance, is being able to take information and elevate it, not just from a bunch of text and a bunch of information, but being able to put our own sort of spin on it, right, in the form of our subject matter expertise, and being able to add value to the people who are requesting information or requesting deliverables for us. And that then becomes the elevation of information into knowledge, and from knowledge into wisdom. And that's why we get paid. People pay us for the things that we can do based off of the experience that we have, right? And based off of our unique way of seeing the world, which is typically represented in the companies that we work for and the departments that we work within, and then our job titles. That then helps us to understand what our responsibilities are. And so broadly, understanding the way that the enterprise, the organization is structuring or manipulating that information is really on understanding each tool on an individual level, but then being able to take a step back and understand how these tools are working together in order to translate information into knowledge and then ultimately wisdom. All right, so that's all that I got. As a quick reminder, what we talked about today was the overlap between information architecture and how we are leveraging our information architecture as it relates to the way that we are using our digital tools and digital solutions. So just a quick rundown. My recommendation is understanding what your user needs are, right? And that includes both internal teammates, that includes yourself, as well as external stakeholders, right? Really understanding what they require from the information that you are responsible for disseminating. My second recommendation is in the form of creating a consistent labeling structure and naming conventions. Those are very, very, very important in the form of mutual and shared understanding. My third tip was in creating a hierarchy, right? The way that we are establishing precedent for the way that information needs to dynamically travel from top to bottom, bottom to up, from left to right, et cetera, et cetera. My fourth tip was around faceted classification. So work on creating a faceted classification system that, again, creates mutual and shared understanding within your organization. My fifth tip was around creating scalability, right? And understanding scalability as it relates to how big or how small your information system needs to be, not just today, but then also tomorrow, right? And a lot of that comes in the form of, having or creating some review systems around where you have been, how your information system has changed with time. My last point was around understanding your enterprise, again, leveraging this concept known as tools and rules. It's understanding how the information that we are responsible for, that helps us to create logic and shared understanding, it becomes really important to understand, on an individual level, how we're leveraging tools and how those tools are responsible for manipulating information, and then broadly as an organization, how those tools and how those rules all work together so that we can be consistent in this dynamic process of manipulating and sharing information so that it has the ability to elevate into knowledge and then ultimately institutional wisdom. And through, that elevation process, we are then creating value for our various stakeholders, right? So that's all that I got. Again, my name is Terrence Latimer. I am an informations, communications, and technology consultant based in the Mojave Desert. I love all things regarding tech, writing, information systems, enterprise resource planning, unified communications, and I do my best to share the wealth of information that I've spent, the 12 plus years of my career learning and having to find out the hard way. My job or my desire is to make your job that much easier. So it's my hope that you follow me on Medium, you subscribe to my YouTube channel, and then also connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm always looking to make new connections who are interested in this very nerdy stuff that keeps me up at night. But I hope you're doing well. Have a great rest of your Friday, and I will talk to you soon. Take care.